Welcome to Read, Talk, Grow, a podcast where we talk about women's health using books, especially fiction, memoir, and creative nonfiction, to build understanding and empathy around health-related topics. Our goal is to suggest books for those interested in health topics that are typically considered private and intimate in an effort to get people talking and connected in accessible ways. In short, we hope to put the right book in the right hands at the right time. I'm your host, Dr. Denise Millstine. I'm an assistant professor of medicine at Mayo Clinic, where I practice women's health, internal medicine, and direct the section of integrative medicine in Arizona. In addition, I'm an avid reader and love discussing books. I'm excited to talk about today's books. We'll primarily be discussing Susan Wiggs' Sugar and Salt, which I want to warn you has some trigger warnings and some spoilers will appear in this episode. So if you need to, pause the episode, read the book, and come back. My guests today are Susan Wiggs. Her life is all about family, friends, and fiction. She's the author of more than 50 novels, including the beloved Lakeshore Chronicles series and New York Times bestsellers. Her award-winning books have been translated into 24 languages. Recent books have included The Lost and Found Bookshop and the most recent Sugar and Salt, which we'll be discussing today. Susan lives with her husband at the water's edge in Washington State's Puget Sound, where her favorite exercise is curling up with a good book. Susan, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I love podcasts, and I'm excited to talk today about Sugar and Salt.
My second guest is Dr. Kate White, who is an associate professor of obstetrics and gynecology at the Boston University School of Medicine and the vice chair of academics in the OBGYN department at Boston Medical Center. She's a fellow of the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists and of the Society of Family Planning, and a member of the American Public Health Association. A board-certified OBGYN, Dr. Kate has been caring for women for more than 20 years, helping them navigate periods, childbirth, pregnancy loss, and other stages leading up to menopause. She also conducts research in contraception, teaches medical students, residents, and fellows, and lectures regionally and nationally on topics related to women's reproductive health. She's the author of several books, including Your Sexual Health, a guide to understanding, loving, and caring for your body. Dr. Kate lives outside of Boston with her husband and their 3 children. Dr. Kate, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It is such an honor to be here. And Susan, I cannot wait to discuss your book. I am only a writer because I was a reader first. And I agree with you about like the best sport being curling up with a book.
Well, thank you. It's such a pleasure to meet you. I was very apprehensive about knowing that I was publishing a book. I'm not from any medical field. I tried to do my due diligence in researching the book and getting the proper information on the page without overloading it with technicalities, but I was always apprehensive about professionals reading it. So thank you. And I appreciate the work that you do.
Now, these issues only come alive in writing like yours because people can only read so many think pieces and news analyses. It's really when you think about the context of women's lives that these issues really, I think, can penetrate and hit people in a different way. So I'm so grateful for you for taking the work I do in nonfiction every single day and making it really accessible to people.
Well, thank you. Yeah, sometimes I think most of my knowledge about things that I have no familiarity with comes from fiction. So I depend on the authors to have done their homework, at least a little.
So, Susan, you're particularly a popular fiction and a romance author. And we talked very briefly before we started recording about how many people might think that these are escapist reads or your beach read, your weekend read. But in fact, many books in the genre actually intentionally bring up very serious topics that are researched. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, like Kate, I was a reader before I was a published author, and books meant more to me than just an escape for the weekend. And so I really honor my readers for spending, their time with something that I've written. And so in that way, I'm so grateful to be here and to have you take this book and any book seriously fiction informs us in ways that are subtle, I think. And a story will kind of grow on you. You open Sugar and Salt and you think you're reading about this adventurous young woman. She's going to open her signature barbecue restaurant in San Francisco, and her life looks like, just a really fun ride. And yet, as you get to know Margie in the book, you discover this backstory that happened to her that I hope is as authentically drawn as it could be in a piece of fiction. And what I found after the book was released, two things I found. Number one, I found that readers were surprised based on the way that the book was presented in the cover art, that there were some real dark threads to this story. And also I found that what happens to Margie in the book resonated with readers in some pretty profound ways. One of the joys of the digital world is that I can get immediate feedback from readers, and I certainly did on this book.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because my friend showed me this advanced copy of Sugar and Salt and said, this book is about reproductive rights. And I thought, that looks like it's about cakes. So I agree that the cover doesn't give warning to that, but hopefully the more it's in the world and people are talking about it, particularly for readers that need a trigger warning in case they're not in a place where it's the time to read that book. But the book is very timely. Dr. Kate, you had recently published a post for the Women's Health blog through Mayo Clinic Press about the confusing shift in the world with reproductive rights. And I think you would agree that Sugar and Salt is really an incredible example of what some women could deal with in this era of their rights being limited.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad that the book doesn't come across as an issues book. I'm glad that it has cake. I actually would have preferred barbecue on the cover, but I know it's a publishing house decision. But this idea that this is just integrated into people's lives. It's not something that you sign up for. It's not something that's just a chapter that you close, just like with Margot, who Susan is how I think of the heroine of the book, that this is a part, whether it's the sexual violence, the unexpected pregnancy, the challenge you're facing and what to do with that pregnancy, what you might face in thinking about placing a child for adoption. This is a part of the fabric and the history of a lot of people in this country. And it coexists along with other hopes and dreams and finding new love and all the and making a big move and things like that. So I think the book was perfectly on point for that.
Well, thank you for that comment. When I set out to write the book, I actually didn't set out to write an issue book. So that message sort of crept in as I was creating Margot's story and what brought her to this point. And it came about actually from an article that I read it was either in the Rolling Stone or the New Yorker. It was a true story of a woman who killed the man who was sexually assaulting her in Alabama. And the only way that she could gain her freedom was by pleading guilty to murder. And so I learned a lot about, the injustices that come about against women in particular, and poor women who don't have the means. And so her story evolved organically the way fortunate things that happen in our lives do as well. And the other thing that I should point out for your readers, because the crime takes place in Texas, is that when I was writing it, it was 2019, and some of the new laws were not on the books yet. And so my editor actually made the very wise decision to have the book take place in, I think it's either 2017 or 2019, because some of the points that happen in the book would be moot now just because of that. And I feel for you so much, because I know your profession is struggling with these new issues that have been dropped in your lap. How do you help women who need reproductive health care, and the laws are now changing so fast? How do you meet the needs of your patients?
And I think a lot of readers, even of novels, aren't necessarily huge consumers of the news, right? How many people read to the 24th paragraph in an article, which is why there's been so much confusion about what's still legal and what's not. And I think a lot of people don't realize that these issues affect them and the people that they love. And it's not until they face it and they say, what do you mean I can't get birth control? What do you mean I can't have an abortion? That
Mhm.
all of a sudden, what had just been political rhetoric and noise in the background now has really huge impact on their lives, which is what Margot faced in prison. And a lot of women are now facing across the country.
She's a pretty typical woman of very little means. She grew up in a trailer. Mom passed away. Stepdad was not a good guy. And so she's kind of been on her own from teenagerhood, and which is an unfortunately common situation, I think, for a lot of women. And she wasn't sophisticated. She was smart, but not really educated. And so she did find herself exactly in that situation where something that never crossed her mind, being in prison and finding herself pregnant, was the last thing on her mind. And yet now she's faced with it and discovers how limited her options were there. There was one review of a book. Actually, it wasn't a review of a book. It was a note that I had from a reader that said, I was mad because I was afraid that this book was pro-choice, but then I saw that it was pro-life. And then I realized that I wanted her to have a choice. And so it was both pro-choice and pro-life. And I like that it does spark different sides of an issue for the readers. And it's a book club book in that sense, where people can talk about both sides of an issue, hopefully not come to fisticuffs. I didn't want to promote my point of view, of course, have a very strong point of view about it, but I didn't want to promote that because it's a work of fiction. It's not a work of the author's opinion.
Right. It was Margot's point of view you were trying to
Yeah,
put forward, which I think you
yeah,
really did beautifully.
yeah, go
I just
ahead.
want to re-emphasize the point about this being inspired by true events, that when you look at all of the things that happen to, for those who haven't read the book, Margie and Margot are the same character, but she changes her name as she changes her space in life. These things seem exaggerated, and yet you are really fictionalizing from real events, real women whose cases you were able to research and read about. So while it might seem impossible, it has happened, and it has not just happened once.
That's correct. There's a brief author's note in the back of the book that references a couple of the instances when this has happened. And by the end of the book, I just kind of wanted to shine a light on it. I didn't want to shout it from the rooftops, but people can learn more about it, if they're so interested. But yeah, the case that sparked the backstory of Sugar and Salt, the woman's name was Brittany Smith, and she was in Alabama. And another thing, your comment reminded me, the laws change. They're meant to evolve like that. But one of the ones that I referenced in the book was called No Duty to Retreat, which is kind of a controversial law in Texas. I don't know if it's controversial in Texas. It seems like it would be, about what is allowed when you're defending yourself from a violent act. What are you allowed to do? And, what is considered a crime? And so that definitely comes into play as well, especially since there was, I tried to show a dichotomy between the way the justice system treats a person of wealthy means versus a woman who comes from poor background.
Not just the justice system. And for those who haven't read the book yet, this happens, very early on, but you have this woman, as you said, who grew up really on her own with some help from people she connects to in the community, where she learns to make her amazing barbecue sauce. But then it's the hometown hero who assaults her. And what happens is the community is mourning his loss and blaming her for being in her own kitchen making her barbecue sauce when a man comes in uninvited with whom she thought she might like to be involved with and had cut it off with. So that part is actually a very common story, and how we treat as a community, as a culture, the woman who was assaulted by looking for how it's her fault is something that has to change.
I totally agree. Thank you for bringing that up because it persists even today. We'd like to think that we have evolved beyond, but you still encounter situations where they say, well, what were you wearing? Did you have anything to drink? And the point that I hope readers take away from that situation with Margot is that there is one cause of rape, and that is a rapist. Nothing that she was wearing, nothing that she said, nothing that she had done in her past. And so I assume that's the takeaway. That's definitely the feedback that I'm getting. And I don't write books to enrage people. I do. There are other things in the book. There's a really, really sweet love story. And that was a bit of a juggling act as well for me creatively, because how do you take someone who's had this incredibly damaging thing happen to her in the past? She'll never be the same person again, but how do you find somebody she can move forward in her life with? And Jerome, the love interest, I think he's quite the fantasy man, but it was a real creative juggling act for me to make him, number one, believable, but number two, someone that you could see Margot with for the rest of her life.
So many women have lived through trauma, whether or not they have PTSD, as they've survived these things, but women are survivors, as a lot of people are. And I love the idea that even with the most traumatic history and the difficult upbringing, sort of against all odds story, that you can still find love and that there can still be someone for you. So I know it's a little bit of a fairy tale. Jerome certainly, was very fairy tale like in a lot of ways, but that idea that you are not broken, that your past does not define you, that you still get to go on and deserve to have love and happiness and your dreams come true. I think that is a really wonderful message, because when you start to think about just how often assault happens, how often trauma happens, it's really easy to get caught up in rage and despair. So it's wonderful to see someone really thrive on the other side of that.
Yeah, thank you. I tried to embed situations in the book showing Margot growing in her empowerment as she moved away from that incident. She joins a self-defense class and she moves ahead with her career plan, and she starts a food truck and meets some really positive mentors along the way. And I hope that women who are surviving something like that look for the mentors the way that Margot did in her life, because that is key. Getting yourself some self-care, the therapy, if there's physical problems, help from their doctor. And I appreciate so much the medical community's support of women in this way. Pretty much every doctor that I know or have met is incredibly concerned with this and supportive of this. So thank you to your whole profession for that.
I just want to restate as well that this is one of the beauties of this book being in the romance genre, which is that the end. You don't know how you will get to the end, but the reader is assured that they're going to walk away with an ending that feels at least hopeful, full of love, in that type of energy, as opposed to all of the darkness that you go through with Margot as she navigates her past. And I love how every single one of your relationships, other than with the rapist, is driven by love. Even his family loves him so much that they are sort of blinded by his actions. And not that that justifies how they attack her, but without conflict, there is no novel. So I think it's really beautiful that all of the people are just demonstrating love.
Thank you. And thank you for mentioning that the fact that it's a romance novel is a message to the reader that if they pick it up, no matter what happens through the course of the story, there will be a likely positive, uplifting message. Maybe not totally wrapped up with a bow, but it will be a positive, uplifting message. And I think that's the promise of a genre book, a romance genre book, that people will get what they earned in the end of the book. And so in that sense, I do agree that maybe a book with really hot topics like this should have a trigger warning, but the fact that it's a romance novel is going to tell the reader, go ahead and go through this with her because it will turn out in the end.
Another inspiration for the book is the adoption process. So, Dr. Kate, you help women navigate choices with unexpected or unintentional pregnancies all the time. Talk a little bit about how you approach that.
Yeah, we conduct options counseling a lot for people who are facing an unintended pregnancy that they genuinely are not sure what to do. Obviously, there are three choices when someone becomes pregnant. They can choose to not have the pregnancy, they can give birth and then parent, or give birth and then place the child for adoption, which is not an option that a lot of people will consider. I think most women will only consider either parenting or having an abortion. But for people who would find this as a sort of third path or a different way, I think it can be incredibly rewarding. My mother was adopted, so this was a very like pro-adoption thread in my entire family. And one of my best friends became a parent through adoption. The person who birthed his son also became pregnant as a result of rape. And just like Margot, really wanted something positive to come out of the experience. So she chose an open adoption where she does keep in contact with my friend and his husband. And so is in the child's life, a very remote but still present way. So adoption can be incredibly positive, and it's nice to see more positive adoption stories in media and in books. I wasn't sure how much we wanted to spoil with this book, so I wasn't going to bring it up, but since Denise, you went there. And so watching the relationship develop between Margot and the adoptive couple that she chooses, and how much they would love her in their life, as to whatever degree that Margot is ready for that, I think it sort of shines a light on what adoption looks like in modern times, which is very different than, let's say, when our mothers were growing up, where a girl was sent away to have a baby and it was placed in private. It was shameful, and she didn't see the baby, let alone hold it, and then came back and was supposed to never think about it again, which led to so much trauma for people who place babies for adoption under those circumstances, as opposed to it being a very empowering choice, the way that it is for Margot in this book.
Thank you, Kate. And also thank you for the language that you're using around adoption. I was quickly drawn to the fact that you place a child for adoption. You don't give them up. You don't give them away. All of those are sort of outmoded phrases. And so I tried to be really careful in the book with the messaging around the adoption process. And that was such a fascinating deep dive that I did into that world. I was so unfamiliar with it. And it's fascinating and also heartbreaking and uplifting as well when I see how what people who choose that path, it's not always the easiest. It probably never is. And yet Margot's choice, she struggled with the choice. Thank goodness, back in 2019, she had the choice, but I liked her struggle. I liked living through it with her. The outcome just seemed satisfying. And her adoptive couple was quite the fantasy as well. I mean, the bazillionaires with the guest house and the perfect dog and everything. But I thought, well, she needs a little uplifting fun in her life. So I made them a very fun couple that she would have confidence in.
Margot needed a fairy tale at that point. She needed a little bit of something, right, to pull her out of the abyss she was in. But I think what was really, telling her so important about Margot's story is that she was able to make the choice that felt rightest to her. And the right choice doesn't always feel good. It's not always full of happiness, but it is sometimes the thing that you just know deep in your soul is what is right for you. And that is what I wish that all women and people who could have pregnancies could feel. Margot started out pursuing an abortion and was not able to get one because the system effectively prevented her from being able to exercise her right to get one, which was still a right in 2018. But in the end, she still might have had that choice, but over what evolved over time was that a different choice then felt right. And as hard as it was, and it doesn't mean that she doesn't think about it and still have feelings, but she didn't really regret the decision, even though it's hard. And that idea that something can be hard and right at the same time, I think is a really important message for all of us, honestly, for all of our decision making, but particularly around pregnancy.
Your story was actually inspired by friends of yours, right, Susan?
That's correct. I have a friend whose son and son-in-law wanted to have a family together, and so they pursued that. And I got kind of an up close and personal view of how fraught that process can be, and it's exciting, but it's also incredibly dicey. Is it going to happen? Is it not? It was really fun for me to be on the sidelines looking at a happy outcome for this family. And so they were inspired. And one of them actually is a physician. I got some other information from them too to inform the book.
Well, the book is clearly so well researched and I think really quite brave. I hope that everyone who's listening to the podcast will pick up Sugar and Salt by Susan Wiggs. And if you have young women in your life, absolutely, your sexual health does talk a bit about contraception and reproductive rights in a very brief snack kind of accessible way that you could leave on someone's bookshelf to dive into when those questions come up for themselves or for their friends. My guests today have been Dr. Kate White and Susan Wiggs. It has been such a pleasure to talk to you both about women's health, reproductive rights, abortion, adoption, and sexual assault. We covered a lot, all from your amazing book. Susan, thank you so much for joining us.
You're so welcome. It was an honor to be here today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us to talk books and health today on Read, Talk, Grow. To continue the conversation and send comments, visit the show notes or email us at readtalkgrow@mayo.edu. Read, Talk, Grow is a production of Mayo Clinic Press. Our producer is Lisa Speckhard-Pask, and our recording engineer is Rick Andreessen. The podcast is for informational purposes only and is not designed to replace a physician's medical assessment and judgment. Information presented is not intended as medical advice. Please contact a healthcare professional for medical assistance with specific questions pertaining to your own health if needed. Keep reading, everyone.